Great. So first thing I did was change the title. So a little less technical. I thought I'm going to be covering some material that's pretty deep technical material, but also some other insights that this group has gained over the last couple of years. So this is an update on some work that this group of interesting parties has been performing in an area located south of the American River. And it's been performed, as I say, over about 2 years as funding has allowed. So it's a work in progress, and there have been many contributors, and I'm going to try to acknowledge all of them throughout the presentation. So here's the outline. We're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that we see for recharge projects. Then I'll introduce you to the study area and the project concept. Then we'll look at some site evaluation results for 2 sites. And then we'll get into some takeaways, some with respect to quantity and some with respect to quality. Okay, so I think most people in this viewership, and I hello to all of you. I looked briefly through the list and know many of you. I think most people are well aware of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. I'm just going to give a quick little review for anybody who might be relatively new, or at least so they can see what it's like with respect to my take on it. So here's a hypothetical hydrograph: depth to water on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal axis in years, starting in 2015 when responsibility under SGMA began. We have 2 phases of portions of time here. There's an implementation phase that takes 20 years, and for many basins that began in 2020. For some others, it began in 2022. And then there's a management phase afterwards. And there are 2 metrics for a specific subbasin or part of a subbasin. There's the measurable objective, which I think we'll, for the purposes of this discussion, we'll call the sort of the long-term management target. And then there's a minimum threshold, which we can think of for the purposes of this discussion as a hard stop. So it doesn't help that we began this process during a drought, and in many cases, we might expect to see groundwater levels declining for some period during this implementation period. But then by the time we get to sustainable management towards the end of the implementation period, water levels should be managed about that measurable objective. And then there may be periods in the future when there's drought where water levels will decrease again and then have to be brought back up to that measurable objective. And enhancing recharge is going to be really important to get those water levels back up there. So that's some of our interest in managed aquifer recharge, is to help with SGMA. So review of the groundwater sustainability plans generally shows that the smaller subbasins, and maybe some of those are the medium priority basins, have smaller groundwater budget deficits. Some of them are less than 10,000 acre feet per year. And then on the other end of the spectrum, some of the large critically overdrafted basins can have more than 100,000 acre feet per year groundwater deficit at the beginning of this implementation period. And those numbers are projected to be even larger if you factor in the effects of future climate change. So given the size of those groundwater budget deficits, one recharge project or facility probably isn't going to balance a groundwater budget. And you're going to need to think on a larger scale and operate on a larger scale in many areas, and think about recharge programs instead of projects that are equivalent to a significant part of that groundwater budget deficit. Not surprisingly, appreciable amounts of water and land are going to be required. And there are going to be some other resources and assets and considerations that would be required as well. And we'll get into some of that in a minute. But one party may not control all of the components necessary for success. And interests and concerns among those involved parties likely are going to vary and maybe even conflict in some situations. And this next slide will give you a little bit of a sense of what I mean. So success for a MAR project or program, is going to depend upon aligning the parties' interests and considerations. And there are going to be many of them. And here are some potential examples: water needs, land uses, infrastructure commitments, regulations, and jurisdictions. And you're looking for that sweet spot, that overlap, where you can satisfy all of these needs. So there are going to be management tensions as a result. There are going to be different demands for the water and for the land and for uses for the infrastructure, and maybe a variety of jurisdictions and regulations that have to be worked through. So multi-benefit projects is sort of the holy grail of many of these MAR programs, where we're looking for a way of sort of holistically looking at all of the needs and aligning the interests. So the idea with a multi-benefit project, and I should mention that Gary Bardini and Tim Washburn from SAFECA have spoken about this concept in this area at length. We might be able to talk about more of it during the Q&A period. But the concept in general, or in short, is that within the context of multi-benefit projects, you can focus on mutual interests and arrive at solutions. So I contend, and many in our group contend, that it's important to seek opportunities to align those interests and motivate participation. And when you think about that, and our experience shows in the work we've done so far, is that the requirements are going to be in addition to technical competence. You're going to be looking for entrepreneurism and collaboration. You're going to want some people that have insights into organizational behavior. So the needs of the team are going to be broader than just a technical skill set. Some of you may know of Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. He discusses many of the different personality types and the functions that they serve when you're seeking to implement some sort of a project for the greater social good, the connector, the maven, the salesperson. All of these types of people I think, have a place when you're trying to develop a MAR program. So getting back to Sigma, and then we'll move on to the next point in the outline. Some people, this is 20-year implementation period, and some people have said, well, that's too long. Others have said, well, I'm not sure it's long enough. I'm not sure what the right answer is there, but I just know that we do need to move along when you think about all the things that we need to do in order to make a recharge program go. There's coalition building, there's funding development, planning and design, permitting, construction, operation. And let's not forget that we actually have to do all that and then allow some time for the groundwater system to actually respond to the recharge measures that we're implementing. So the study area and project concept. So it's south of the American River. It's the South American and Cosumnes groundwater subbasins. Zooming in on it, the South American is a high priority basin, so its implementation period began in 2020, and the Cosumnes is medium, so it's 2022. The groundwater budget deficit is approximately 10 to 20,000 acre feet a year. It's mostly located in the south. There's over 100,000 acres of irrigated agriculture in this area. And there are many conditions that are conducive to a successful MAR program. The first being proximity to a large river system. The second being a flood control and storage reservoir system that can be modified and reoperated to create relatively predictable diversions for recharge. So there's Folsom Reservoir in the top of this photo. That's part of that system. There's also a canal, the Folsom South Canal, that's capable of conveying significant diverted volumes to recharge project areas. There's cropland potentially available for recharge, and there's also been quite a bit of preparatory coordination among the many management and government entities that would be involved. There are also instances of geology that's conducive to high infiltration rates. So here I'm showing some work from Steve Maples and Graham Fogg. The hotter areas are the areas that are best for recharge, and we'll get into it in a little bit more detail in a minute. But these red areas south of the American River are what Graham has been discussing for many years now, these incised valley fill deposits, in this case, paleochannels from previous courses of the American River. There's higher recharge potential in this area north of the Cosumnes River. The Cosumnes River is the dividing line between these two subbasins. But there's greater recharge need to the south, and that's where actually the storage space is for recharging the water. There's a depressed water table in that area. There's also the ability to create multi-benefit projects. Some of them are flood control, supporting environmental flows, supporting groundwater management, assistance to local agriculture, and some water banking opportunities for the larger geographic region. Many parties are included. I think I've included everybody. If I haven't, I apologize. So here's one of the acronyms that I'll use today, FERO-MAR. So this is a concept that Gary Bardini and Tim Washburn of SAFECA have spoken about many times. The idea is to modify the upstream reservoirs in the American River watershed to provide additional flood storage when extreme rain events are forecasted. So flood-informed reservoir operation, that's FIRO. And that will free up space for wet year storage down in the Folsom Reservoir, creating a net improvement in flood control. And then using the Folsom South Canal, that water can be wheeled or conveyed down to recharge areas. Calculations done to date suggest that maybe 125,000 acre feet might become available through this approach in 4 out of 10 years, so an average of about 50,000 acre feet a year. Considering the recharge projects that we might implement, we need to think about things at a site-specific level. And one thing that we all agree on is that the projects must fit into the pre-existing land uses. So we need to think about the activities and the conditions and what space and timing considerations and constraints they might impose. Then you also have to think about the subsurface. There can be stratigraphy that could impede infiltration. And here in my poor artwork, my cartoon level artwork, I have a gray layer. Maybe that's a clay or a silt layer that's going to impede infiltration on its way down to the blue layer at the bottom, which is the saturated zone where recharge would actually occur when that infiltrated water actually joins the saturated portion of the system. There could also be contaminants, legacy contaminants or other contaminants. That's this orange sort of cloudy area I have below the land surface. And they could be flushed down depending upon what type of recharge was implemented. And unsaturated zone wells may be a promising approach to deal with some of these problems. So Barbara Washburn, who's a director at Otumnee Water District, has been, and others have been evaluating this method for quite some time. And it's a focus of our work at this point. The idea here is that the unsaturated zone wells have a small footprint. They can be started and stopped easily, and they can be tens of feet deep. I'm going to show you a 50-foot deep one in a while. And therefore, they can bypass quite a bit of the layering and the shallow contaminants in being effective recharge facilities. So the areas that we're focusing on are outlined here in red. They're based on factors that include proximity to conveyance, access to some land where there were willing landowners, some geology that's conducive to recharge, and some of the benefits that might occur from the recharge. And the primary question that we're interested in investigating is what's the scale of recharge that might be achieved? And the tools that we were using to look at that are geophysical surveys and some pilot testing. So let's look at a couple of results. Or a couple of sites, excuse me. So as I said, we're focusing on unsaturated zone recharge wells, and we've looked at a site in each of these two subbasins. Site 1 is up in the South American, site 2 is just south of the Cosumnes River in the Cosumnes subbasin. So different approaches at each site based upon a little bit on philosophy and quite a bit on logistics and funding. So in the first site, we did a geophysical survey, then performed some confirmatory test boring. And we had the possibility of doing some pilot testing that if you'll see for reasons that'll become evident, we didn't do. The second site, we did a geophysical survey, didn't do the confirmatory test boring, and went straight to the pilot test. So let's take a look. So the initial screening was met for both of these sites. So there's a willing landowner, it's near a source of water, the Folsom South Canal. The hydrogeology was favorable, and there were some potential benefits to doing the recharge. So in terms of the favorable hydrogeology, here we're looking at some of those results from Maples and Fogg that I flashed up before at a larger scale. Now we're zoomed in. They're based on two pieces of work done by different graduate students in Graham's research group. First, Casey Merovitz, 15 or so years ago, made a geostatistical model of the sediment structure. Steve Maples then came along and did unsaturated zone flow simulation, where he simulated recharge from spreading basins at the land surface and color-coded the results based upon what he found from that modeling work. So the red indicates 20 inches a day average recharge over a 30-day period of ponding. There's also a gravel pit nearby, so some more favorable indications of favorable hydrogeology. So we did a TOTEM survey. So TOAD, time domain electromagnetic survey. That's Ahmad Baruzmand on the ATV pulling the instrumentation through this field. And you can see in the right-hand plot here that we did about a 2-mile stretch parallel to the Folsom South Canal. And you'll see some of the other dimensions of it in a moment. But that's what we did. And then Ahmad inverted the data. He did the modeling to interpret the data that came back to give us this block of geophysical survey results. And then we looked at these and we said, well, we know where the water table is. You can see the white dashed line in the right-hand figure. It's about 90 feet down to 180 feet down to the water table. The inverted block of data goes down to 360 feet, so well into the saturated zone. It's a little under 900 feet wide and about 2 miles long. And there are these very hot zones, both above and below the water table. More resistive, higher resistivity numbers, these hot zones, can indicate coarse grained sediments. You need to be mindful of soil moisture content and water quality, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we thought, hey, maybe these are conductive zones and maybe they're paleochannels. We also saw this very cool blue low resistivity layer roughly coincident with the water table. Maybe that was an impeding layer. So we thought we need to do some test borings here. So you can see these 2 test boring locations indicated in the block of geophysics data. So we asked for support from DWR's Sustainable Groundwater Management Office. They have the Technical Support Services program, and they were willing to help us. So we located some samples, some test borings in order to sample as much of the variability of the geophysical results as we could. We had some limitations related to site access and biology. And we were hoping to be able to answer some questions about what are the effects of moisture content in the unsaturated zone, variations on resistivity. What's the effect of the sediment type on the resistivity? How can we interpret this geophysical data set? So DWR contracted with Cascade Drilling. Sonic rig was brought out to the site for 2 weeks in September, this past September. And we did some continuous coring with a 4-inch barrel. Bryce Russell from DWR did a lot of the logistical organization and then was there on site for 2 weeks doing the coring and the logging of the cores, And Bryce was supported by Bill Brewster, Steve Springhorn, Tim Godwin from DWR's Sigma office. I spent some time out in the field with Bryce, 1 day on each hole. He was 5 days on each hole in the hot sun. And I wanted to get some familiarity with the logging and the results so that I could take it to the next step and take a look at the facies. But here's another slide about what Bryce did. He manually logged these holes according to the U.S. Unified Soil Classification System. Looked at the percent coarse, the color, the moisture, noted hard pan and paleo soil. We then took a look at it in terms of doing a preliminary identification of the facies based on the texture and came up with these classifications. So the channel deposits were the sand and the gravels, high percent coarse, low percent fines. The levees were fines with some sand. The overbanks had no coarse material in them. And then there were these debris flows, which were mixed and poorly sorted. And here are some plots of the way those groups plot out. So the levee are in brown, so low percent coarse. The channels have the high percent coarse. The debris flows are all over the place in orange, and then the overbank had no coarse material in it. So then we wanted to correlate this resistivity information with the lithology information with the resistivity information. And we noted that it could be complicated for 2 primary reasons. First, resistivity varies with sediment characteristics. Resistivity goes up as grain size goes up. It can go down as moisture content goes up. It can also vary going down as total dissolved solids goes up in the moisture contained in the soil. Also important to think about is the fact that there are differences in the scale of the data support. Resistivity is an integrated response in 3 dimensions. The values are for discrete model layers in the inverted model, starting at about 1 meter thick at land surface and down at depth at 360 feet. They were 8 meters thick. Compare that with the sediment logging, which was one-dimensional but continuous and logged on a 1-foot interval. So different scales that had to be contended with. Apparently the most important variables in this case with respect to the resistivity were the grain size and the soil moisture content. We didn't think there was going to be much difference in dissolved solids at the scale we were investigating the situation. So here's some plots of resistivity versus percent coarse and the average facies indicators in the saturated zone. And this did what we expected it to do. Relationships are as we expected, as percent coarse goes up, as grain size goes up, the resistivity goes up. Compare that to what was going on in the unsaturated zone, where there's a lot more scatter, and it's really hard to interpret these data. Variations in the moisture content really created too much noise for us to evaluate them. And it's not surprising when you think about the fact we have an 180-foot unsaturated zone, wet and dry seasons, variations in sediment properties. You're going to get pulses and pockets of moisture. The quantification during the logging in the field was also necessarily approximate. And I'm not sure that it would have made sense to try to get any more exacting in the field with respect to the water content, because there was also a 2-year lag between the time we did the totem and the time the test boring was done. So if you plot the resistivity versus facies for the wet sediments on the left and the moist sediments on the right, you can see the difference in the scatter in the data. We are able to model the resistivity, come up with a correlation between the resistivity and the fraction coarse for the saturated sediments that's below the water table. And if you look, the plot on the right is sort of a typical plot of modeled versus observed values. It looks pretty good, but there's this whole piece of the resistivity spectrum that we see in the unsaturated zone, which is left unaddressed. So what to do? Well, visual inspection, some people might suggest it's not that rigorous an approach, but I would maintain that the eye takes into account spatial correlation of similar values. And you can run through various concepts in your mind as you're scanning through a data set and actually do quite a bit. And here I've sort of peeled back on the left, peeled back the data block of geophysical data to show you the facies identified in the borehole for test bore 1. And then on the right hand, come forward in the data block, and I've put the geophysical data that's most proximal to test boring 2 and its lithology. And what you see is that these hotter values in both zones, being the saturated zone and the unsaturated zone, line up well with the channel deposits. There are other deposits in there as well, but the geophysics, as I said, and the soil borings are at different scales. So I would maintain that if it looks like a channel, it actually may be a channel. Same thing for this impeding layer, this blue layer. It lines up well with the levee deposits as they were preliminarily identified. They may be actually overbank deposits. It was a preliminary identification based just on the texture. And when you think about the spatial extent and the geometry, it's probably more appropriate to call them overbanks. But anyways, we're able to see some things from the geophysics here pretty clearly. Final technical slide for this site. There was also an AEM, airborne electromagnetic flight, that went right through our data sets. We're able to take a look at the two sets of data together, and they're somewhat comparable. The TTEM soundings are closer together in higher vertical resolutions. You get more detail in terms of what's going on, but you can see quite a bit of it in the AEM. The AEM, on the other hand, penetrates deeper and shows structures in the saturated zone. So this site may not be the best for recharge. There's no apparent conductive pathways for fast transmission to the saturated zone. There's also a significant lift to pull water up from the Folsom South Canal at this location. It's pretty well incised into the land surface. But one might be able to factor stormwater capture into the planned housing development in this area. That's something to think about. Okay, site 2, same idea. Willing landowner. It's near a water source. It's got favorable hydrogeology, which and also potential benefits, which include supporting environmental flows in the Cosumnes River. We've got the geostatistical support that shows the geology is favorable. We've got our nearby road cut, thanks to Chris Bonds from DWR over on Dillard. He took a picture over on Dillard Road when he came out to visit us in the field one day. So here we did an ERT survey, electrical resistivity tomography. And this was done by Ahmad again, but more recently, Gordon Osterman and Scott Bradford from the USDA are doing some geophysics out here. And here are the results. Now, this is a log scale, whereas the other ones that I showed were at a linear scale, but the red in the unsaturated zone is the same value. So you've got some good higher conductivity material here, and you even got material that's even higher, that purple zone in the core there. And we see this dipping structure into the subsurface. So we decided to put a well in here. And Steve Julian and Mike Wakeman at OHWD led that effort. And this is what the well looks like in terms of its construction. It has both an injection casing and a monitoring well casing, both of which are instrumented with pressure transducers. Here's the installation, which was done by Travis Pacheco and Torrent Resources team. And then the instrumentation and the telemetry were done by Jeff Walker and Andrew Calderwood and Laura Folia from Larry Walker Associates. We didn't log this well as this hole as it was being installed, but we did look at the cuttings, which were organized from shallowest to deepest afterwards. And I saw these gold flecks in there, and knowing that this was near where gold was first discovered in California, I greedily got out my best Tupperware and panned out the gold flecks, and they turned out to be pyrite. So no gold for me, but pyrite is consistent with the depositional environment that we would expect here, some channel deposits. So we used a temporary water source. I guess I should mention that this well was never intended to collect surface water because there are prohibitions in Sacramento County for doing that. So that's why the culvert sticks up above the ground a couple of feet. We used a water supply well that's located about 60 feet away and have a transmission line to bring the water to the well, and we recharged it. And we did a short test at about 380 GPM. And if you had done that 24/7 for 6 months, which is the way we're thinking these wells might be operated, you'd get about 300 acre feet in the ground, and you need about 30 to 70 wells to address the basin deficit. And there was lots of room for additional injection based upon the space in the injection casing. Then we did a longer test at a lower rate, but it was lower because we couldn't use all of the supply from the well for 2 days. But again, good results in terms of the ability of the system to take water. And there wasn't much head loss. We have these transducers inside and outside the injection case, and not much head loss at 380 GPM across the screen. So all indications are we could put a lot more water in the ground here. We're just not sure how much more. We're not sure how where the 380 GPM would level off, and whether if we ran longer, whether it would fill up the conductive structure. We did get a third unexpected test, though. You remember that the levees along the Cosumnes River broke in December on the 31st, and there was a flood. And here you can see the hydrograph. I started getting data coming to my phone saying that the well was operating. Well, the injection well was operating, but I had data that was saying the pumping well wasn't operating. Well, that's because it was coming from a flood event. And you can see the magnitude of this flood event and the duration of it relative to the previous testing. My best calculations, I'm still working on this, but I think it was flowing at about 1,000 GPM into the subsurface at that point. So we have these 3 tests that range in terms of the amount of volume of water from 1 to 17 times as much water. And future plans here are to do a longer term pilot test, possibly evaluate a second location on the property, and move up the learning curve for this type of assessment. Maybe we'll get a monitoring well in at the water table to see the mound up of water, if we can get some funding for that, and ultimately work towards using the Folsom South Canal as a water source. So, takeaways. So far, I've been presenting quite a bit of technical information, but a lot of work has gone into accessing these sites and thinking through how to scale things up. So some of what I have to say is sort of our group knowledge isn't as technical. So, first, it's very important to think broadly and deeply about program development. How do you align party interests and motivate participation? How do you overcome challenges, impediments, and meet the needs, the varied needs of a MAR program? And importantly, create project momentum. Many suggestions will be made and only some will come to fruition, but it's really important to exercise that marketplace of ideas and maintain project momentum. Fewer opportunities than appear on the aerial photographs may actually exist because that initial screen is quite tight. Proximity to conveyance, willing landowners, compatible land uses. So I'd suggest that you try to make use of every site that may be viable. It's going to take many sites to reach program scale, and not all the sites are going to be perfect fits. So if the hydrology is better than poor, I'd suggest considering using it to add to your recharge program. So then in terms of the technical sort of takeaway from all the technical information, we have this need to support doing these projects quickly in order to support momentum and attain scale. And I think it's important to do projects scientifically, but not to overstudy them. And with respect to the essential elements for the site evaluation process, geophysical surveys are a must. Confirmatory boring, maybe it's not necessary everywhere once you know an area. And pilot testing is important, but maybe as you move up the learning curve on project build out, the need for that could even lessen as well, as you're really just trying to get to scale as efficiently as possible. Okay, a couple of comments on water quality. So we're talking about quantity so far. Quality really matters. It's a complex topic. I'm going to give you some thoughts, really just points for beginning a discussion. So there are many considerations. Are some of them going to be exclusive? There are some cases where there's going to be a tension between maximizing quantity and protecting water quality, and there may be some difficult trade-offs that need to be considered. So there might not be a perfect solution. Here, if you think about the trade-off curve between maximizing quantity and protecting quality, if you look at a point on this curve, if you go to the left, you could be maximizing quantity by taking as many sources of water, as much water as you can. Maybe some of it's going to have a variety of qualities. On the other hand, you could really be protective of quality and put a very tight screen on all sources of water that you use, but then you're not going to get as much water in the ground. So there's a tension here. You always have to think about the source water quality. The conditions are going to vary, and timing and hydrologic event might be something to think about. For instance, if you're thinking about surface runoff in an urban environment, you might not want to take the first couple of flushes of water at the beginning of the wet season. That's probably going to have more constituents in it than other. If it's materials that are adhered to suspended solids, that might be readily addressed. If it's dissolved constituents, but the constituent has a high maximum contaminant level, the water might be acceptable in many cases because the quality the concentrations are low. It's these dissolved constituents with low MCLs or guidelines even, because they're emerging constituents that don't have MCLs yet, where we may have some problems. So planning horizon matters. If you're thinking about short-term impacts from washing down legacy contaminants from the unsaturated zone versus the longer-term benefits of doing the recharge, and maybe putting clean water into an area that has water quality that isn't as good or is projected to get bad if no actions are taken. I'm thinking about things like nitrate and total dissolved solids. There are some there's a balancing act to go on there. This is in the realm of policy. And those emerging contaminants are really going to involve some policy considerations. I think about 1,2,3-trichloropropane and some of the polyfluorinated alkyl substances, all of which we're considering in the single parts per billion as being a problem. They're widespread, they're persistent. There's even now some research suggesting that they're unhealthful levels already in rainwater falling out of the sky. Maybe we need to think about point of use treatment options to allow recharge projects to occur when we're thinking about those constituents. So just sort of the way you could giving a sense here of how you could shift that efficient frontier, that trade-off curve, if you allow point of use treatment. Last couple of points. The best way to do recharge may vary based upon the site considerations and site conditions. Here, a pond could be great in an area that has no impediments in the subsurface, no concerns, and lots of space on land surface. In other cases, a recharge well might do the job quite well in an area you couldn't otherwise affect recharge. There are some concerns. Permitting of this type of a well isn't accepted everywhere, and one of the concerns is injection of untreated surface water. And here, I think the point to consider really might be, what is the travel distance through the unsaturated zone before you get to the water table? So you could have a situation where you have a pond accepting untreated surface water that has the same travel distance to the water table as a recharge well. The recharge well is in an area where you couldn't put a pond. You still have what is considered in the pond instance an acceptable travel distance. Maybe this is something to think about as well. And that's the end of my talk. Here are a couple of my hobby photos.
Thank you very much, Rob. And we have time for discussion and questions. Anyone who wants to ask a question, I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you want to ask a question, I suggest raise your hand and unmute, show your video, and ask away. I can start with one. On that dry well by the Cosumnes, the intake rate was 1,000 gallons per minute. Is that what you said?
That's my estimate. We tested it up to 380, but when you look at the amount of available mound up that's left in the injection casing and some initial calculations I did, I think it could be 900 or 1,000 gallons a minute pretty reasonably. I'm in the process of doing some unsaturated zone modeling to see if I can shore up those estimates.
Is that typical for a dry well like that, or is it does it indicate really good site conditions at that location?
I think those are great site conditions. I'm not sure you'll get conditions like that all over that subbasin. The hydrogeology in that area seems to be pretty conducive to accepting water into the subsurface, especially with the recharge well. There was a much cooler zone on the top at that site that one would have had either to move over to stay and take a more circuitous path down to the subsurface or poke through this lower hydraulic conductivity material that was on the top. So
it suggests that finding sites like that with coarse grain channel deposits and so on is really worthwhile for
sure
for local recharge facilities like that. I think that's worth emphasizing.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question here.
Hey, it's Roy. Hey, Roy.
Hi, Rob. How are you?
Good. How you doing?
Good to see you. Hey, I think you laid out very nicely a lot of the challenges in trying to find the sweet spots for recharge. And one thing I just thought I'd mention is even getting the water into that first zone below, at the water table, say, may only be the beginning, because unless you have hydraulic continuity from that down into your, I'll just call it your principal aquifer, so the zones that are really being pumped by, say, agriculture or whoever's doing most of the production, and where is that pumping occurring, is getting that hydraulic communication all the way down to those particular zones, or you're just recharging some shallow aquifer that maybe is not your target zone. So unfortunately, the geology needs to cooperate deep enough to where you can get the water where you ultimately need it.
And I think that's one of the benefits of the AEM. I showed the totem and the AEM results there, and maybe the AEM results didn't look as high resolution for the unsaturated zone for getting the water down, but it does show you the structures down. I think those data went down 400 or 500 feet, right? So you're getting down.
That's good. Some
of the zones that you're interested in. Yeah, I remember you had shared with me years ago the transfer well data when you guys were in
That's right.
Investigating how do we get our recharge water in the shallow zone to best use in the principal aquifer down deeper where we're using it when there's this impeding layer in the saturated zone.
Exactly. And hydrographs, if you can get some multi-depth wells in, I know they're very expensive, but at least a few in your target areas, and you get one in the, say, where your recharge water is going to reach in the shallower wells, and then maybe you can get another monitoring well down, say, below some theoretical or potential impeding layer. And if the hydrographs do tend to match each other, maybe not perfectly, but you see some patterns, then that might give you more confidence that these zones are at least regionally in communication with each other, and that water will likely eventually get down in there if one is flatlined and the other one's bouncing up and down, then you go, uh-oh, we may have a real impeding layer here that's preventing that downward movement. But that's that overall understanding. So I appreciate everything you're doing and great presentation. Thanks.
Thanks, Roy.
There's a question in the chat, and then Manu had a question. We'll get to him next. But Mike Antos in the chat asked, doesn't that question involve an unspoken temporal component? So you guys may have just touched on that. Infiltration now will arrive somewhere under force of gravity, right? And then he adds a comment, how long between infiltration and arrival at a pump zone is too long to count?
I guess one could cast that as an economic question. If you're spending money today on infrastructure improvement and operations to get that water in the ground, and you're not going to see the benefits for a couple of years, well, if you're able to compare the benefits and the costs fairly close in time, discounting doesn't matter too much. But if it's 10, 15 years between the time you make the investment and the time you realize the value on the water, at least in some people's minds, some managers' mind, that might start to be a situation where it's economically not viable. But if you start to take even a longer term view of things, where we need to manage our groundwater systems and we need to get water in today to use in the future, maybe even a longer time frame would be acceptable. I think it's going to be very site specific, and it's a good question. I don't think there's a specific answer yet.
Let me add some experience with that along the Cosumnes. When we used to do a lot more water level monitoring during flood, including the monitoring we did after the 1997 flood in the Cosumnes, there we saw more or less instantaneous response to the groundwater levels. And the water table goes up, and then the deeper groundwater levels also respond, but with more of a delay. So I would say, and there's other experience with floodplain monitoring along another part of the Cosumnes. So I think in the Central Valley, there's lots of these impeding layers, but in general, on a regional scale, there's enough vertical connectivity to get things watered down faster than you might expect. And Mano, I think, had his hand up next. So go ahead, Mano.
Hi there. Thank you, Robert. That was a fantastic presentation. There were some numbers that were there that got flashed by, and I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Did you say that there are 100,000 acres that are suitable for recharge in that American Valley? Sorry, if that's the number that was there.
There's
Is
about
that how I should
100,000 acres of irrigated agriculture in the South American and Cosumnes subbasins. So when you're thinking about a portfolio of approaches for getting water in the ground, some of it might be AgMAR, right? So we're flooding fields for certain periods of time every year. Some of that land might be useful in that case.
In that case. So, and the other number is that you said 125,000 acre feet of water could possibly get recharged. Is that, well, what does that mean, right? Is that a timeline, or if you extend this project, that can be done? How are you thinking about that?
That's within the context of the FIRO part, which is sort of the inflow to the MAR part. So if you look at, and Tim Washburn is on the line here. If I get this wrong, Tim, please correct me. But if you look at what they're thinking about doing in terms of changing the way they store water higher in the American River watershed, they'll be able to open up some storage to hold water down in the Folsom, so that then they can gradually put it into the Folsom South Canal and move it to sites where recharge could occur. And if you look at the expected precipitation and the way that system would work, maybe in 4 out of every 10 years, you could create a benefit of 125,000 acre feet in 4 out of 10 years. So if you average that over 10 years, it's about 50,000 acre feet.
50,000 acres. Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you.
Okay.
In the chat, we have a question from Gretchen Murphy. Do you have any comparison of the amount of recharge in these study locations compared to recharge in the river or on nearby floodplains?
I don't. Graham, you've done some work on the Cosumnes on this.
Yes, and I would say we don't have good enough numbers to answer that. It's a great question, but I would say we don't have the numbers to answer it. You know, the modeling that Rob referred to, that Stephen Maples did in that regional area of the study area, indicated that, you know, you get recharge in the fine grained materials also. In fact, what Stephen saw in his analysis was the response of the channel network is quick if you access it and get the recharge water in at the top. Quick meaning weeks to months. But over the subsequent months to years, the water storage change in the groundwater system in the parts of the system that are not aquifer, which is most of the system, is also substantial. So that's commonly not known and not accounted for in what's going on here. So that's another layer to the issue. There's a question from Kamyar Gavechi. Will this effort look at the needed permitting / regulatory / water rights to use flood and or FURA water? And I assume he might be referring to the fact that Sacramento County was not wild about the idea of putting surface water into a dry well for recharge.
So there are, and yeah, this wasn't my part of the project, and other people can chime in as appropriate. I think Kamyar might have even been asking about a whole bunch of other regulatory and permitting challenges to swiftly recharging water. It's a big topic these days. But with respect to the permitting here, there is this concern that putting untreated surface water directly into the ground is a risk to water quality. But I would maintain that if you have a pond, seepage pond or recharge pond that you're putting untreated untreated surface water into, and it's got a certain depth of to the water table, that's a travel distance to the unsaturated zone, and that's deemed okay. If you have that same distance from the bottom of a recharge well to the water table, you should be in a similar type of a situation. And there's a state water resources control board has a guidance document on what they call dry wells. I call them unsaturated zone recharge wells because dry wells can be used for in a waste disposal context as well. But that concept is in that guidance document as well. But I think that this is, you know, as we ask more and more stringent questions and seek to manage our resources more and more in a more and more exacting way, we're going to keep coming up with new questions like this, and we're going to keep pushing the policy boundaries, and we're going to require regulators and policymakers to work with us to pick through some of these challenging questions.
Rob,
Yeah,
can I just interject? I think Chris Bagan is on the phone, on this call or Zoom call, and he's with the Storms program that issued that guidance. And I'm wondering if he might have any comments or thoughts on this issue.
Okay, well, this is Chris Beacon. I work for the State Water Board. I'm in the Storms program. Yes, we contracted with a consultant to put together the dry well guidance that you referred to. The only thing I'll say is our focus has always been on our urban stormwater runoff. I was working with Scott Seifried for a while before he retired, who was also very involved in the Sigma and the FloodMAR programs at the State Water Board. I think he was working in Gamma. And I'll reiterate, his concerns weren't necessarily that the, assuming you're talking about collecting surface water from rivers and irrigation canals and that kind of thing, it seems like the threat posed by that would be much lower than what's in urban runoff. But I think some of the problems were what's happening if the water gets into the water table and starts pushing around existing plumes. So those are the questions I have. The other thing too is that, you know, at some point, somebody mentioned the county was not happy with dry wells. Us in the storms unit have talked to the county, and they're still pretty strongly against dry wells. And I'm not at a high enough level to do a whole lot about that, but the other step is to get the regional board involved, Central Valley Regional Board, because I think they can potentially issue a permit. And then there's, I think, going back to what Graham had mentioned or Robert mentioned, there's also a water rights aspect to this, but that's out of my bailiwick. But it's also something that I think the water boards, water rights people have some have put together a permitting program that hopefully makes it a little faster to get a permit for this now.
But there's
Barbara,
there's
Barbara
then-
did.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, Barbara, did you have any other questions that?
No, I was just curious, Chris, how the water board is advancing the initial guidance that Rob referred to, the work that Geosyntec did to look at the broader use of dry wells in the kind of context that Rob's been talking about.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll tell you, my focus has only been on municipal urban runoff, and so I wasn't. This project has been postponed for another year because I've got another project that's been deemed a higher priority. So my focus again is going to be on municipal urban runoff and the use of dry wells to capture stormwater, urban stormwater for that.
Orit, do we have time for a couple more questions that are in the queue here?
Well, we're just about a minute to the end. So if you want to just touch on one question, we could probably do that and then we can wrap it up.
Oh, well, this person called Orit Coleman asked the question, how did you get landowners agreement and commitment to recharge?
And just to add that I'm asking this question because you started the presentation very nicely by highlighting the importance of identifying shared interest and bringing different stakeholder into the conversation. And seems like the landowners are an important group to really connect with.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important to have, and this is, let me back up. Sigma very much gives control to the locals. And that's something that I think comes from Eleanor Ostrom's work, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist who looked at managing the commons and specifically water and groundwater. So you need to have people on the ground. You need to have people that are invested in that community, that know the people in that community and are able to talk about the issues that matter to them in order to craft an approach to the solution that meets everybody's needs. So it's, in this case, I know that Tim and Barbara were very involved. Tim and Barbara Washburn were very involved in talking to their neighbors and other people in their community that they knew to see who might be interested in doing this. Some people are just very socially minded and are supportive of doing it no matter what. As long as it's consistent with what's going on in terms of their other uses of their land. Others maybe need a little bit more enticement, but it's an ongoing discussion. That's all I can really add. I don't know if Tim or Barbara want to add any more than that. No?
I think we have to close, but there's one comment that I'd like to at least introduce. We don't have time to discuss it, but Thomas Biglione points out the need to be careful about diverting too much water, including high magnitude flushing flows from the American River due to effects on spawning beds and salmon and so on. And I think that's an excellent point. I think it's the context behind a lot of this work has been there that the dam operation needs to be for multiple objectives, including electricity, water supply, downstream flora and fauna, and recharge. Everything except recharge has been factored into the reservoir operations, basically. So, but I don't think anyone's advocating that recharge needs to be the top or the only priority. But thanks everybody for getting together, and thanks again, Rob, for a wonderful talk. Let's give a virtual round of applause on that, and look forward to seeing everyone a month from now at the next LunchMAR. Or Reed, is there anything else that needs
No,
to-
just thank you, Graham, for leading our discussion. Really appreciate it. And thanks, Rob. And we hope you will register for our network conversation coming up later this month. I left the registration link in the chat. And thanks, everyone. And looking forward to seeing you soon.
Take care, everyone. It's a pleasure.